It's humbling to stand up here, not only looking at the program and seeing who else is standing up here this weekend, but also just from having had a chance to visit with people along as we've been here and seeing how many of you could easily stand up here and tell similar stories to the one that we're going to try to tell. So with that in mind, I'd like to start with a word or two about why it is us instead of somebody else. And there's kind of a funny parallel between how I first got tangled up with the Land Institute and how we ended up being here talking this morning. I was early in graduate school and really casting about, almost flailing, you might say, to try to come up with a dissertation research project that would both satisfy my advisor's criteria for sort of professional academic legitimacy on the one hand, and also on the other hand, meet my own standards for doing something that was at least remotely related to figuring out practical strategies for sustainable land management. It's not necessarily such an easy marriage. And it was about that time that I saw an announcement that the Land Institute was offering graduate research fellowships in natural systems agriculture. And I jumped right on that and fired off my application. I was fortunate in the timing. The program was in its early days and there weren't that many applicants in a given cycle. So I lucked out, got my proposal approved, and not long before I came to the initial fellows orientation workshop, my advisor said, yeah, that project you wrote up, I don't really feel like I can get behind that. I think you need to come up with something else instead. And I was like, well. So I showed up in Kansas for the fellows orientation workshop and was kind of in the position of telling the folks who had approved this project I proposed, about that. I'm not going to be able to do what I said I was going to do that you said you would pay for. How about this other pretty much totally unrelated project that I've come up with instead? Would you be willing to fund that? And the folks here at the Land were very kind and gracious, and they said, that's all right. Come on ahead anyway. We'll make it work. So during the course of that fellowship program, I met a young man named, he was young at the time, Fred Utzi, who I guess some of you might have come across. Fast forward a few years, Fred and I have a couple of things in common. One of them is that we both come from this family farm tradition, and we've both grappled over the years with different ways of trying to stay connected with that land and the farming operation while still enjoying some of the other conveniences of modern life. And, Fred's aware of that too. And so he was getting the theme of this year's festival hammered out and called us up and said, Wylie, I know you guys are making a go of living out there on the old family ranch, and we think you might have a thought or two that would be relevant to this year's theme if you didn't mind to come and share it. And I said, well, Fred, we're touched and honored, but about that, at the beginning of this year, we gave all that up and moved to town. And Fred, in that same tradition of kindness and graciousness, said, well, that's all right. Come on, hit anyway, and we'll work it out. So that's why we're here, and I'll hand it over to my wife to continue for a second.
Good morning. I think this is for taller, fairer-skinned men, maybe. No, I did. Thank you. I was just being facetious. If somebody told me 15 years ago that I would be given a talk at an event like this, I would laugh. I would not even know what the event was about. I guess my connection to the land and to the Land Institute requires two stories. One is a story of disconnect, really, of my inability to understand my father's connection to the land. He was born on a harvest day, wheat harvest, in 1945 in this village 2 hours inland from the Mediterranean coast. That would be close to a few hours from the Syrian border today, to give you an idea. It's a very agricultural area, but like other people of his generation, he had to leave it in order to gain more money, prestige. He was one of the two of his 13 siblings to be able to go to college and become an engineer. So we grew up in the city without being able to understand what that plot of land that he refused to sell meant to him. And I remember that it was the saddest I have seen him when he had to sell it because he couldn't afford to pay the interest on the debts that he was accumulating to raise his 3 children. So fast forward about 10 years, more than that. No, after he died in 1996, I went on to college, and then I went to Texas to get a master's, where I met this man. And so my other story is a story of connection to the land that began with him and our trip up to his folks' place from College Station, Texas to almost to the Oklahoma border. We were traveling one evening, and at some point I realized this guy that I thought was so nice might be kidnapping me because there was nothing. And I told him, this is what? I said, what is this? He said, what do you mean? I said, this miles and miles of nothing. And that must be offensive, Wes. But to me, there was just grass. There was nothing else, some trees I couldn't see in that moonlight, just the headlights, and we turned on gravel roads, and I started getting scared. And I said, no, he can't. He's not gonna kill me. He's just like, this is gonna work out. And so it was a really lovely house, and his folks were great. They had just moved from town into the house, and the story after that is just a story of joy, really, the best part of my life. We grew lots of things together, and now we're growing 2 kids together. So just the ability to grow your own vegetables. Never tried grains. Well, he did. I don't think we succeeded very well. But and to be able to eat our own beef from our own cattle, that's amazing. That's amazing. But it is also hard work. And in one of these, I'll just give you an example of the kind of work that it requires. We have 2 places. One is his mother's, where her house is, and one is ours, where we have our house. We call it the hay house because it's built out of hay bales. And we shepherd our cattle between the 2 places. And there is a blacktop, an asphalt road between the 2 places, inconveniently located. And so we do this 21st century mechanical shepherding thing with him leading them and me kind of standing where they might go into the neighbor's gate. It's really not glamorous work. And so one of these days we were engaged in the same adventure, which is regular now. I went up to the top of the road to slow potential traffic down. Now, we don't have much traffic, or we didn't used to about 8-10 years ago, but now we do because we have all these wineries popping up, bringing Dallas folks to enjoy the scenic view and the wine and all that. And so it's a little more tricky now. I have to stand there, and I need to be really seriously watchful. And then on one of these days, I was there, and Wylie was shepherding the cattle across the asphalt. And then this white SUV just slowed down, and there was this wide-eyed lady. Just, really you could tell she was so satisfied. She had wine and the scenic view, and then this was really cool. And so she says, she actually posed a question that we've often grappled with and didn't know how to answer. She said, "Oh, is that the farmer?" Okay, you'll just have to imagine the Texas twang. It doesn't overlay very well with my own accent. But that's how I came to be on the land. And I'll leave with that question of whether that is the farmer and switch to Wylie.
So that's a question that we face a lot of times in a lot of ways. I've lost count already of the conversations I've had with people just this weekend where one or the other of us says, well, a real farmer. And what is a real farmer? And that's a question that we really need to, I think, hone in on and be conscious of the terms we're using and what we mean, especially if we're trying to come up with some way to do these things that we're talking about this weekend and get better connections between the city and the country and the people who grow the food and the people who eat it. And there's a lot of unpacking that you could do with that question. Who's the farmer? Is that the farmer? I mean, first of all, and most obviously, here are two women stopped by the side of the road asking each other what's going on. And one of them assumes that the other can't be the farmer. If she's got any connection to this, she must be the farmer's wife, right? Because women are farmers. So there's the first one. But, when you think about the agency in this country that manages agriculture, supposedly, the USDA, their definition of a farmer is pretty broad. I don't know, there's probably several people out here who could throw it out for me. But if you sell in 1 year at least $1,000 of agricultural products, you're considered a farmer by the United States Department of Agriculture. If you narrow that down to the number of people in the country who are breaking even on the agricultural products that they sell, you lose about half of the 2 million farmers, and you're down to around 900,000 or a million. And if you tighten it up to only the ones who are netting around the U.S. median income, so a little over $50,000 in a year, then you're down to 320 or so farmers, again, out of a national population of over 300 million. 1,000 farmers. Right. So, as Brian mentioned, there aren't that many, and so when you're starting from that small of a base, you don't have to add that many to make a big percentage increase. But again, this is, another thing we talk about is, agriculture in rural areas, and I think a lot of us, myself included, tend to conflate that a lot of the time, and we tend to think, okay, when we say rural, we're just talking about farmers and farm country, and maybe the farm country part is true, but depending on who's doing the defining of what rural is in this country, you've got a rural population of somewhere between 45 to 60 million people, and again, those 320,000 earning a living farmers are dispersed amongst those other millions. And then you come to this term, agrarian. And I don't even want to attempt to define that. But I think we've heard already plenty just this weekend to justify the claim that you don't have to be rural to be agrarian, nor do you necessarily have to be a farmer, at least by any of the definitions that I've just mentioned. Maybe you grow almost all of your own food and you don't sell a dime of it. Maybe you live an ethic of caring for the soil and the land without growing any food at all. I would argue that all of those people could still be considered agrarian in some meaningful way to the project that we're working on this weekend. We personally, I would say, fall into all three categories and into the first two definitions of farming. We make more than $1,000 a year on our enterprises, and we don't, at least most years, we don't lose money on it, but we're certainly not making a living. So we're part-time farmers. As of January of this year, we're weekend rural dwellers, and we're full-time agrarians. I count as the fifth generation of my family that's been on the land that we work. My ancestors first showed up there in North Texas sometime in the 1850s during Texas's first attempt at statehood. The last time anybody made a living on that land was my grandparents, and they managed to put all four of their kids through college on that living as well. That was the first generation of my family to go to college. And if you follow the trajectories of those kids through their lives, they all reflect, whether by choice or not, kind of the different broad strategies that I think still exist for balancing this desire to remain on the land and remain connected to the land on the one hand, and to have sort of a comfortable modern existence on the other. From the uncle that went into the spectrum, who went away pretty much entirely for the duration of his career, was a high-powered business executive living different places all over the country, and only at his retirement did he come back to the farm and sort of take up the life of a gentleman rancher. You could look at my dad's path. He was a civil engineer with the state highway department. He managed to keep his postings within that system to within an hour or so's one-way drive of the farm, and he used the income from that profession to support the nighttime and weekend farming. Or his other brother who worked blue-collar jobs close to home, lived right on the farm the entire time, but didn't have as much disposable income to throw after the farming habit, and didn't have a whole lot of more extra hours to put toward it than my dad did. When I was growing up, my uncles and cousins would all get together for the farm chores, whether it be working cattle or baling hay. And I was the youngest of my whole crop of cousins, so I was just getting underfoot in those days. I wasn't able to pitch in. And by the time I was old enough to pitch in, everybody else had aged out of it or dispersed to some other pursuit. And so nowadays, we buy our hay in, and I still haul it myself. And when it's time to work the cattle, I either haul them to the vet or call the vet out to our place, but I'm not about to try to take that on solo. I didn't really think as I was growing up that, I wasn't conscious anyway of a desire to stay connected with the land and take up farming as a vocation. But it had enough of an impact on me that I knew I wanted to be working outdoors in some capacity with whatever career I pursued. So I chose biology as a major in undergrad. I didn't learn till later that what I saw recently summed up in a BBC interview with a professional ecologist who said, there are only so many formally trained scientists, and many of them have to spend more time in front of the computer than you might expect. So biology as a choice of profession doesn't necessarily achieve that goal of keeping me outdoors for my day-to-day. I was lucky enough to get a chance to travel for several months between college and graduate school, mostly in Mexico and South America. And that, strangely enough, was sort of the wake-up call for me in terms of what a privilege it is to have stable access to land. And as a result of that, I sort of became aware of a sense of obligation that, at least on this particular patch of ground, if I don't take on the task of nurturing that land, there may not be anybody who will. And obligation is a bit too blunt of a term to throw at it. It's that sense that I should be doing it if no one else will, and also a sense that my doing that will be a source of pleasure to people that I care about. And so kind of from that moment of realization forward, I could think of my life as sort of a set of serial compromises between that desire to be a homecomer and a homesteader and a liver on the land, an agrarian, and lots of other desires that we come across in life, such as to have a life partner, to have a family, to have a decent income, to have health care and high-speed internet and good schools for the kids. So starting in graduate school, we were both at Texas A&M. That's about a 5-hour drive one way from my family's farm. And I would do that drive at the start and end of every weekend through 7 years of graduate school. We moved back to the farm when I was finished with my PhD, and we were there for about 9 months. And then Ӧzlem started her PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So during those 5 years, I was 2 weeks on the farm and 2 weeks in Wisconsin, and that was how we split it up. And when she got close enough to the end that she wasn't needing to teach or take classes, she moved back full time and promptly landed a job where she still is teaching the University of North Texas in Denton, which is only a 1-hour one-way commute. And she did that 2 days a week for most of those 5 years. And it's only this past January, when our first daughter was old enough to start kindergarten, that we finally broke down and said, I went through the small town schools that our daughter would be going to if we didn't leave the farm at this point. And I feel like I turned out okay, but at the same time, I don't know if I want to roll those dice again with her. And so from that, I think I'll hand the mic back over.
So what I was doing up in Madison, I was pursuing a degree in sociology. So I'm a sociologist, and when I am faced with questions as big as these, the question of change, we see a problem. How do we make change happen? I get excited, but then I get depressed because Sociologists know something about what we call social structure. And that's essentially the idea that we are all born into certain patterns, certain arrangements of practices, ideas, institutions that make it very difficult for any one individual to chart their own course as they wish. And I think somebody said this nicely, men, of course, back then it was normal to just say men make history, but they do not make it under the conditions of their own choosing. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. Many of the cards have been dealt, and we have to play with the cards that we've been dealt. When we say social structure, we're talking about things in the context of agriculture and farming, of things like patterns of land ownership. It's really one of the biggest sources of wealth inequality, perhaps in the world, a very deep source of wealth inequality that cuts across other issues such as racial and gender inequalities. We're talking also about patterns of work, who gets to do what kinds of work, and how work is valued. We're also talking about what kinds of jobs are considered respectable and make you stand out as a story of success among your peers, for your parents. All these things that I think people who are trying to affect change, people who are in this barn today, perhaps are grappling with, or at some point did grapple with, or will perhaps grapple with. And I can talk about some examples of how this plays out, some of the exclusions and inclusions that we all experience or observe play out if we have time for it later. But so if we inherit this weight of history, we find the world not as we like it, but as it is, and the landscapes and the culturescapes that we would prefer were changed. How do we make change happen? I would like to propose a concept that I have been developing in another context, in the context of my own research that has nothing to do with farming and agriculture. I would like to propose that we think with this concept of a native outsider. The concept of native and the notion of nativeness is too loaded for my taste, as you can see from my accent, because there is so much bad that happens in its name. But when I say native outsider, I'm trying to catch a dynamic, a tension between these two terms. Native, that is being of a place, being ties to and roots in a place, which can be developed. You don't have to be born in a place to be a native to that place. I'm also talking about how people recognize you as belonging to that place. And I think that is largely a result of your presence and your deeds. A third dimension of being native to a place is feeling like you belong to a place. And that is also, it also has a very social dimension. You can't just feel it because you feel it. People have to recognize that you belong to that place. So what do I mean by a native outsider? A native with deep roots and ties in and to a place would sort of know the landscape, would know its history, would know the culturescapes, would know what ideas prevail, what people mean by certain words, and those little subtle gestures that is mutually understood. Being a native means that you have a really good handle on these things, but, and here is the tricky thing about being a native, is being aware of all of these does not necessarily make you want to go along with them. So you need to be an outsider as a native in order, I think, to make change happen. You need to be an outsider in two senses. One, you need to be able to stand outside the social relations. This is not really possible. This is the sociologist. But you need to be able to observe. You need to be able to observe that what we take for granted is not at all natural. That it was the product of millions of people doing things certain ways, and that it can be changed. And if we don't like it and we want to change it, it is up to us. So being an outsider means recognizing that things have come to be this way because people made certain choices, and that we can undo some of those choices and make new ones. Being an outsider also means questioning this notion of nativeness and not taking it for granted. So I would like to suggest that a lot of the people that people in this room have read and respect, including Wes, including Wendell Berry, Gene Logsdon, all the guys and gals. Sharon Astic, is that somebody who's also gone back to the land? Are native outsiders. They have been somewhere else and have had these ideas about how things should be done. They have come back to their places of origin, which gives them a certain sense of authenticity and authority. The two etymologically share the same root, authority and authenticity. I think of Wylie as a perfect example of a native outsider. Folks around where we are plant Bermuda grass, because that's what you do. As soon as we got on the land, he set about restoring native grasses. So I would like to suggest that we think of ourselves as native outsiders. We think and play with this notion of what it means to be a native outsider, but also recognize that as individuals, whatever we call ourselves, we cannot affect change. We need communities. We need communities of practice. We need communities that will help boost our morale when we are skeptical and when we are down. There is a guy, this wasn't in part of my talk, but hearing Brian talk about his skepticism reminded me of this guy, Antonio Gramsci. And he speaks of this notion of having a pessimism of the will, a pessimism of the intellect, what Brian is talking about, but an optimism of the will. And when we feel like we don't have that optimism, it may be because we're lacking that sense of community, or we're disillusioned with how much we have been able to accomplish. So I remind all of us to build communities, to stay close to those communities, even if it's in our isolation, once-a-year events like these that help build community, and come back to this notion of how we can make change little by little to be ready for when perhaps the conditions are more ripe. So it's not at all a waste of time or effort to talk about these ideas, to talk about basic income, to talk about a living wage, to talk about environmental justice, to talk about racial justice. All of these ideas, we have to keep pounding on them, because the time will come when we'll be ready to roll them out and say, we have a vision, we have a plan, and here are the communities that are already doing it. Thank you.
Speaking of hard acts to follow. There's a reason that she usually gets 100% of the mic time in our family and I sit in the background. There would have been a time that I would have argued against classifying myself as a native outsider, but I had to give it up. And I didn't have the terminology at that time, but what crystallized it for me was once when I had sat down and tried to explain to one of my uncles what I was researching for my graduate work at Texas A&M, and he was nice enough about it. He didn't roll his eyes or laugh at me as I was making the attempt to explain it. But when I got back the next weekend, my parents were chuckling over what he had told them about that conversation. And they said, "Yeah, I realize Wylie's not down there studying at A&M. He's down there and they're studying him." So we are hoping that the story that we're attempting to tell doesn't come across as we tried to make a go of farming on our family's land and everything, the deck was stacked against us and we couldn't make it work. The story that we're trying to tell is we tried to make a go of living a version of the agrarian dream with the deck stacked largely in our favor, and due both to the weight of history that Őzlem mentioned, circumstances being as they are, we have chosen to modify the implementation of that dream yet again in light of other priorities. But I want to spend the rest of the time that we have, and we're at risk of squandering Brian's carefully sequestered 10 minutes. What time that we do have, I want to try to broaden it out beyond just our experience and to say something that I hope would maybe be relevant or inspiring for others in similar situations or contemplating being in similar situations. We were dealt by the genealogical lottery the get out of jail free card on the single biggest obstacle to entry for new farmers, which is that we have stable long-term access to land. And that enabled us to make the choices that we make. And what we'd like to talk about is things that could be done to enable more people to make that choice, to give them the option to get out on the land and stay on the land if they so choose. And as the theme of this year's festival emphasizes, for all that goat cheese dairies and CSAs and so forth are wonderful and necessary and vital, I want to try to talk about this in a way that will also envision viable ways of creating that choice that encompass growing most of the calories on most of the farmland as we get more people onto that land. And I want to focus on the fact that doing so may entail consequences and require adjustments that we haven't considered and that we're not entirely or maybe even a little bit comfortable with. This project and the people who are drawn to it as new farmers and new agrarians may not be who we think of or who we even want as new farmers. Where I grew up, there were a couple of little German Catholic colonies, basically, that were founded at the end of the 1880s and the beginning of the 1890s. And it's funny how language changed. My aunts didn't talk about the Germans as Germans; they called them Dutch. They were from Germany, but to my Anglo-descended aunts, they were Dutch people. And that's not the only phrase I could call up. My aunts refused to call kids kids; they were children because kids sounded vulgar. Kids were goats' offspring. They would never be caught saying bull; it was always the old gentleman cow. And so the Germans were Dutch, and they lived there for from the last decades of the 1800s up until World War I speaking German, publishing German language newspapers in these tiny little towns, and sprinkled, in amongst all of these, Anglo descended folks in the other communities. And my aunt sort of summed it up as saying, those Dutch folks, they were queer folk, but they were good neighbors. and it's the same, I think, kind of acceptance, be it grudging or not, that we all have to sort of try to find within ourselves of whoever shows up to participate in this, regardless of whether they meet our expectations or not. Getting out onto the land and farming, whether for a living or just for the agrarian impulse, growing your own food, etc., may not pay as much as we or the new farmers think that it should. There's this notion of farm parity, and there are probably agricultural historians present in the building who could lay this out in much better detail and with greater accuracy than I can. But as far as what I've read, that idea of farm income parity, which is just simply stated that a family farming for its living ought to be entitled to the same material standard of living as a family that's getting its income from some other source of employment, seemed to sort of creep in as a plank in farm policy like in the early 19-teens or so. And it seems to have been so thoroughly implemented that now I think most of us, if not all of us, would sort of have that as our default assumption without thinking about it. But on the other hand, most of the new farmers that I know are not making as much money as they might be doing pursuing other professions or careers. And most of them are not only conscious of that as they would have to be, but have accepted it as a condition. It's one of the priorities that they've set, and they're sacrificing that income for it. This new agrarian project may involve patterns of land tenure, social organization, and or population distribution that we're also not accustomed to, or at first blush willing to tolerate. I've sat around in workshops and heard Wes speculate that maybe agriculture on the plains would work better if instead of every farmhouse spread out on its own section, you brought all the farmhouses into little village clusters, and everyday people walked out or traveled out by whatever means to the fields and worked them and returned home to a community at the end of each day. Brian bought his farm together with another family that's friends of theirs. There's an intriguing phrase in Severin's title. I haven't even had a chance to meet her, much less quiz her about it, but this issue of customary rights, I think, if I'm interpreting it correctly, may feed into this thought. There's a book for sale in the bookstore, a collection of essays called Rooted in the Land, and one of those essays is a fairly utopian vision of how a Kansas county might go about making local policy to effectively set aside most of its farmland as a farm trust and get new farmers onto the land that way. So there are all of these ideas that are floating around out there. Many maybe haven't even been formed yet, others just haven't been implemented. And again, I think we need to be open to those rather than dismissing them out of hand. I would just throw out this observation that what we think of as cultures of permanence, I think usually get the way that they are out of necessity. Form follows function. It isn't people so much choosing that they want to live in a particular way and farm in a particular way that nurtures and cares for the land, as that they're mostly forced or constrained into those practices by the conditions in which they find themselves. Most of the time, in that land is so scarce that you have to develop those techniques in order not to starve. Something in things like paddy farming and livestock husbandry and farming on alpine terraces, and those are intensely labor-requiring ways of farming. And there's at least some evidence that when people in those cultures and societies do get access by whatever means to a larger land base, they switch to farming that in a way that doesn't require as much hard work and doesn't husband the soil as well as a consequence. I used to read Wendell Berry and think, wouldn't it be nice if we could actually achieve the sort of agrarian vision that he's articulating? And then I would get depressed because I think, well, the machine is just going to keep on devouring people and land until nothing at all is left. Later on, I came to find hope in the realization that the faltering of that machine is not impossible. In fact, it's inevitable. due to material and energy constraints that anyone with a basic ecological education should be able to appreciate. Just because those constraints didn't play out in the ways and at the times people thought they were going to in the 1970s doesn't mean they're not going to play out somehow, sometime. So for me, with that thought, the urgency has translated from stopping the machine before it's too late to getting ready for it before the machine stops, to minimizing the wrenchingness of that transition, to preserving and spreading the knowledge and incubating the arrangements that will be necessary until conditions are able to support them rather than suppress them. If what I'm saying in that last little bit makes sense, great. If I've lost you, then I would refer you to a little paper that's being handed out by Stan Cox over at the bookstore, if there are still copies left. It's 100% Wishful Thinking, The Green Energy Cornucopia. It's a quick read. Great writing by Stan, as always. And so I guess to kind of bring it to a close here, I think, again, that as I was trying to articulate whatever we come up with in the way of a new agrarianism is not going to look familiar to any of us. And that we do need to reach deep inside ourselves for the courage, when confronted with it, to be gracious and kind, and rather than rejecting it, say, that's all right, come on ahead, we'll work it out. Thank you.